Good morning, everyone. Well, I would like to first thank the conference organizers and Isabella for giving us the chance to present our papers in the conference. Our paper is titled Beyond the Arab Spring, Women's Civil Obedience or Disobedience in Conflict and Post-Conflict Context. Various literature explored the victimizations of women in armed conflicts and post-conflict contexts. Hence, they only regarded women as vulnerable and helpless groups. Against such literature, some scholars criticized these stereotypes of women as only powerless victims lacking any active role. They took a step forward to discover the role of women in resisting oppression and in voicing their demands loudly. In all the wars that were fought in Africa and in Latin America, women played active roles beyond the victimization discourse by resorting either to peaceful or non-peaceful and militant means. In armed conflicts and post-conflict contexts, indeed, one has to look beyond the traditional lens that restricts women in the victimization. The aim of this paper is to analyze the various responses of women after the Arab Spring in two Middle Eastern countries, which are Iraq and Palestine. In responding to society, class, gender, or state organizations and systems of oppression, this paper argues that the Iraqi and Palestinian women were motivated to become active agents, deploying different forms of resistance that varied according to the context, hence challenging the traditional stereotyped roles of women in general and of Middle Eastern women in particular as helpless victims. Iraqi women were able to voice their resistance through widespread civil society activism that transcended beyond the local level, while on the other hand, Palestinian women showed more intense resistance through engaging in non-peaceful resistance as well as sumud and cultural resistance, which are peaceful means of resistance. In exploring the various forms of resistance and oppression, this paper utilizes a qualitative methodology that relies not only on literature but also on in-depth, semi-structured interviews with experts and with activists from Iraq and from Palestine, such as Amal Qabashi, the member of the Municipal Council of Sadr City, and Hala al-Sarraf, the head of the Health Access Organization in Iraq, and also a prominent activist, in addition to Abla al-Dijani, the head of the General Union of Palestinian Women, among other feminists and other figures that were interviewed. When starting with the case of Iraq, one has to say that the seeds of resistance of Iraqi women has started years and years before. Early signs of Iraqi women's resistance to oppression manifested itself in 1923, when elitist women such as Na'mat Hamdoun, Asma al-Zahawi, Paulina Hassoun, and others called for a greater role for women in public space, which resulted in the emergence of women journalism and the emergence of women NGOs. In the 1940s, later on, Iraqi women expressed their resistance to fascism and Nazism through establishing the Anti-Fascism Feminist Committee, which was later transformed into the Anti-Fascism and Anti-Nazism Iraqi Women Association, founded by Afifa Raouf, hand in hand with tens of Iraqi women. In addition, later on in the 1948, Iraqi women started to play a more significant role in resisting the British colonization and in weakening the treaties that were mentioned and that were transformed later on. Years later, during the wars and the decade of economic sanctions under the Ba'ath regime, women continued to resist, though differently. Iraqi women took the lead to work when Iraqi men went to fight at different fronts. As Hala al-Sarraf, the activist, says, this has created a resistance against the patriarchal and conservative values, religious ideologies that were maintained at that time. For that, despite such conservative values, religious ideologies, and despite Saddam Hussein's tendency to seek allies with conservative tribal leaders, which even weakened women's position more and more, women had more access to education and to waged labor at that time more than any other time before. As a result, Iraqi women occupied civil service positions and professions that were once male-dominated, such as oil project workers, construction supervisors, engineers, accountants, physicians, and even scientists. In contemporary history, Iraqi women continued to respond to the different forms of oppression inflicted upon them through peaceful civil society activism and non-peaceful resistance. In 2005, 80 women organizations representing different regional and ideological perspectives formed the Iraqi Women Network with the aim of achieving social justice, influencing public policies and social practices to eliminate all forms of gender discrimination and ensuring women's participation in political life. In the interview with Hala Sarraf, she explained that many women organizations took the path of law to defend the rights of the vulnerable, while others worked at the humanitarian level to address widowhood, displacement, and lack of economic opportunities. Indeed, this kind of response or resistance by Iraqi women to take the legal path or the humanitarian path has to be explained and looked upon in the context of the Iraqi insecurity that was available at that time and in the context of oppression that was available from the side of the state at that time. According to Al-Qabashi, Iraqi women's participation in the political process after 2003 was very difficult. In the interview with her, she explained that in 2005 it was true that quota was applied and was developed in the Iraqi parliament. However, the same women who called for the Iraqi quota, a quota of 25% for women, were incapable of engaging and of participating in the Iraqi parliament. Indeed, the quota, after its implementation, the representation of women in the Iraqi parliament and in the Iraqi political process, it has decreased rather than increased. In the interview with Asila Rubai, she continued to explain that because the Iraqi society remains a tribal and male-dominated society, we find that the roles of women and the way to accomplish them are portrayed and subsequently limited by the socio-cultural parameters. Hence, women who wish to participate actively in formal peace negotiations in the parliament or any political process, they should be named by their male political counterparts. And this has resulted in the fact that most of the women who were able to secure parliamentary positions and were able to secure a political role, they represent the traditional conservative parties or are being nominated by their male counterparts, which again reproduce the same conservative system rather than changing it for the sake of more gender equality. This fact has resulted in women's tendency to resist through legal and humanitarian path, through more civil society work on the ground rather than on the national political formal processes as was expected. But clearly the Iraqi women organizations identified easing and removing the suffering and assisting other groups, the vulnerable groups, especially women and children, as their top priority, and in that self they have featured some kind of resistance. Sarraf has pointed, for example, to the Health Access Organization, which was established by 3 women and have been particularly working in the conflict zones to ease the suffering of women and other vulnerable groups, vulnerable Iraqi groups. In the interview with Amal Al-Qabashi, she also pointed to another initiative by 7 Iraqi women, where those women has developed NGOs and they have worked on the National Action Plan in 2012 to implement the UN Security Council Resolution number 1325, which establishes a role for women in peace building. And this resolution has been weekly implemented, but due to the role and the active role of the Iraqi civil society, Iraqi women's civil society, the role for and the implementation of the UN Security Council resolution started to be activated. In the National Action Plan that the Iraqi women has developed, they emphasized a particular number of pillars. One very important pillar was boosting women's participation in negotiations and decision making. Another important pillar was improving their living conditions and ensuring an enabling legal environment that promotes equality and comply with international conventions. This way, as Sarraf reiterates, women did shape our stand as those were mainly female activists who represented Iraq. In 2014 and 2015, Iraqi women started resisting government oppression and the lack of political will in a more explicit manner, taking their battle to the national and international arenas. The Iraqi women NGOs participated in preparing 2 reports on the situation of Iraqi women amid conflict. One was a shadow report to the CEDAW that was submitted in the 57th session in February 2013 in Geneva. The other one was a civil society monitoring report for the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was presented at the commemoration of the 14th anniversary of the resolution in New York. The 2 reports stressed the status of women in Iraq, particularly the levels or the low levels of their political participation, the high levels of violence against women, the high levels of trafficking in Iraqi women and prostitution, and the low standards of personal and marital status. In the 2 reports, indeed, the Iraqi women organizations pointed out not only to the problems and to the conservative societal values and practices, but also to the lack of political will and to the oppression from the side of the government that has led to lower levels of women political participation even after the implementation of quota in Iraq. One can note, however, that the tendency to move from a national or a local level activism and taking the resistance to the international level has been facilitated by the window of opportunity that has been ongoing on for the sake of Iraq and Iraqi women, that at least there is an international support towards women's role in peace building in Iraq, against, as we're going to see, the case of Palestine later on, and against other cases of Middle Eastern women, such as the Kurdish women, who do not join any kind of international support. So on the other hand, Iraqi women, there was some kind of window of opportunity, which actually supports the argument by O'Connell and by Harcourt, who believes that indeed peace building and post-conflict reconstruction gives some kind of window of opportunity for new political actors to engage, especially women, in the political scene. And by taking the fight or the resistance to the international level, the Iraqi women did not only publish international reports and went out presenting them in international arenas, but they also have organized international conferences to show their resilience to violence, to militant acts, to terrorism, to government oppression, to the lack of security on the national levels. One of those forums or conferences has come up with the Erbil Declaration, which stressed on the solidarity between women in the face of militancy, in the face of violence, in the face of religious extremism. Erbil Declaration emphasized the importance of engaging women in peace building, in resolving disputes, in participating in negotiations, but also in helping the survivors of violent conflicts during and after conflicts. And this was only happening because the forum managed to present lively testimonies by people who were victims of the conflicts, the violent extremism and terrorism in Iraq, but also testimonies of courageous women who managed to resist this kind of religious extremism and terrorism. Well, moving on to the second case, the case of Palestinian women. Again, similar to the Iraqi case, public activism and resistance in the case of Palestinian women dates back to years and years before. In the Palestinian case, it dates even back to the mid-20th century with the establishment of the Israeli state. Women activism varied at that time, including engaging in strikes, demonstrations, writing letters to the media, besides receiving military training in both West Bank and Gaza. In 1965, the General Union of the Palestinian Women was created as a mass organization to participate in liberating the homeland by giving services to women in particular. In 1987, Palestinian women from different ages and from different classes started to engage even more heavily during the Intifada through civil disobedience and through boycotting the Israeli products. As emphasized by Ms. Abla Dijani, the head of the General Union of Palestinian Women, in the interview, she said that women started to make up their daily products in their homes. They have even established women cooperatives to support the Palestinian national production. In addition, they delivered social relief funds to the Palestinian families under curfew and participated in throwing stones, burning ties, building roads and building blocks, even taking jobs that were left vacant due to the men detention or disappearance. After the end of the First Intifada, women continued to participate in the subsequent demonstrations resisting the Israeli presence and practices against Palestinians. One very important method of peaceful resistance is sumud or resilience, which for Palestinians mean a method to defy and a method of power. Sumud for Palestinian women is a source of strength, making them able to counter and to combat the Israelis. While the main aim of occupation is forcing people to leave their lands, sumud, on the other hand, reflects the Palestinian women's insistence not to abandon their land, not to abandon their rights. And one of those important rights is their rights to their lands. In the interview with Abla Dejani, she emphasized that although she is the head of the General Union of the Palestinian Women in Egypt, she had an opportunity to sit with the Palestinian leaders for her role. And for her, the role of the Palestinian women living there practicing sumud in the occupied territories worth 100 times the role of other women living outside Palestine or resorting to violent form of resistance. Sumud is practiced by women through their protection of homes, maintaining their presence in their homes and over their lands despite the occupation. In addition, Palestinian women, in the words of Abla Dejani, inform their children about the Palestinian cause by standing there, and by their sumud, they make their children more aware of their culture and more aware of their identity. Since men are detained or are busy with work or are busy with violent resistance and other forms of resistance, women in Palestine, by sumud and by such acts as stated by Dejani, are the ones who keep the Palestinian memory and the Palestinian presence and Palestinian identity alive. In that sense, sumud includes the normalization of life, making it livable for women and for their families. For instance, women engaged in organizing weddings and different celebrations, visiting their relatives and friends, and organizing collective trips. Despite the blockage, despite the denial of their collective right to assembly and to gathering, in an interview conducted by Devor in 2009 with 3 women, they continued to emphasize that they have a different way of enjoying their life, which they practice regularly, either by traveling to the beach, visiting their relatives, traveling to other Israeli cities to enjoy what they are deprived from. Although none of those 3 women mentioned the word sumud or the word resistance clearly, but the description of the obstacles that they face and their insistence to face them and to address them and to be resilient towards them is actually a manifestation, a clear manifestation of resistance. According to Scott's notion of everyday resistance, Palestinians' women's sumud can be perceived as a daily form of resistance, a symbol of such resistance. With their sumud, with their patience, stiffness, and insistence to preserve their identity and their culture, Palestinian women manifested their resistance. In that sense, sumud can be seen as an ideational resistance by maintaining hope and a sense of normality. Hand in hand with sumud, Palestinian women resorted to cultural resistance in the sense of singing folkloric songs, sewing and dressing the traditional costumes, painting ceramics, writing stories, producing documentaries. This is not living by Alia Sanhouri, but she's actually portraying the obstacles in front of women, in front of Palestinian women in documentaries. Another documentary is called Girls on the Sea by Taghreed Al-Azza. So if the Israelis ensures that the Palestinian image is limited within terrorism and victimization, with their control and with their dominance over the discourse and over the narrative of storytelling, by cultural resistance, Palestinian women, and by their sumud as well, they are making sure that the Israelis are not dominating the discourse and that there is another side in the discourse. So through art, through storytelling, through narrating their hard realities, Palestinian women challenge the domination of knowledge and the domination of the discourse, and ensure that the discourse about Palestine remains alive and involve more than terrorism and victimization. The last method of resistance by the Palestinian women is the non-peaceful resistance. So for instance, women like Aida Saada, Fatma al-Bernawi, of course Wafa Idris, women who went for non-peaceful forms of resistance, bombing themselves and bombing other strategic places. They all challenge the confinement of women's roles within the reproductive or maternal role, which is, by the way, sometimes restricted to them by their own society rather than the Israelis as well, or the Israelis only. So as to conclude, clearly the victimization discourse underestimates the different battles that the third world women and Middle Eastern women are engaged in against the wide and varied forms of oppression, and subsequently the different goals and the different rights that they advocate for. With their engagement in resistance, be it violent or non-violent resistance, Iraqi and Palestinian women challenged the overemphasis by literature on the victimization of third world women. As Foucault and Jordan says, whenever repressive power is practiced upon people, resistance in its different forms will be the natural product. Indeed, the link between oppression and resistance is very clear. When faced with various and daily forms of oppression, Iraqi, Palestinian, and other Middle Eastern women has voiced out the resistance to such oppression, and this resistance was unavoidable. Lastly, one would say, or would connote Hala al-Ashfar when she says, conflicts can both empower and disempower women. Women may be both victims and agents of change. In that sense, one can see the victimization on the one side and the resistance on the other side not as extremes, but rather as dynamics that are available in the everyday life of the Middle Eastern women. From victimization to resistance and from oppression to resistance, it's unavoidable. At last, I would like to thank you so much. I'm leaving here my email address, and for any questions and for any feedback, please do not hesitate to communicate with me. Thank you very much.